don't have the right to say no, Caleb said, his voice cold but disturbingly soft. My hands froze mid-motion, my heart pounded like a drum, and my mind went utterly blank. Those words tore through my defenses like a blade, leaving me completely exposed. I stared at him, desperately searching his face for a hint that this was some cruel joke. But his eyes, calm, steady, and unyielding, left no room for doubt. He meant every word. Just minutes ago, it was a normal evening. We sat at the dinner table like any other night. Caleb, with his composed demeanor, had been making small talk about the weather or something equally trivial. I laughed at one of his jokes without thinking, feeling a rare moment of ease. But now I was drowning in the weight of what he had just said. What? I managed to whisper, though the sound barely escaped my lips. My voice was shaky, foreign, as though it belonged to someone else. Caleb leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as if he were assessing me. His gaze softened just slightly, but instead of comforting me, it only made the moment more suffocating. We both know this was always going to happen, he said, his tone disturbingly calm, like he was stating a simple fact. You feel it too, don't you? The room seemed to tilt, the air around us becoming thicker and harder to breathe. I wanted to scream, to tell him he was wrong. But deep down, I wasn't sure if he was. And that terrified me more than anything. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice trembling with uncertainty. Caleb's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. You don't have to admit it now, he said, his voice as steady as ever. But you will. His confidence made me feel small, powerless. It wasn't physical force, he wasn't that kind of man, but the way he carried himself, the way he spoke. It was like he could see straight into my soul, stripping away any pretense I tried to cling to. And the worst part? Somewhere deep inside, I felt like he was right. I dropped my gaze, unable to hold his any longer. My hands fidgeted on the table, desperate to focus on something, anything, that wasn't him. But no matter how hard I tried, his words lingered, echoing in my mind. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unbearable. I wanted to get up, to walk away, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if I were rooted to the spot, caught in some invisible web he'd spun around me. Why now? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It was the only question I could manage, though I wasn't even sure I wanted the answer. Caleb's expression didn't change. Because it's time, he said simply, as though that explained everything. You've felt it building for months, haven't you? That pull, that connection. You've tried to ignore it, but you can't deny it any longer. I felt like the walls were closing in. My chest tightened, and my pulse raced. Was he right? Had I been ignoring something? Or was he just planting these thoughts in my head? I didn't know what to believe anymore. You're wrong, I said, though the words came out weaker than I intended. I needed to sound stronger, to assert myself. But my voice wavered, betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't get angry or defensive. He just sat there, watching me with that same calm intensity, like he already knew how this would end. Am I? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Or are you just afraid to admit the truth? I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, refusing to let him see me break. You don't know what you're talking about, I said, my tone sharper this time, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. He sighed, leaning forward slightly. The sudden movement made me flinch, but he didn't reach for me. Instead, he clasped his hands together on the table, his voice dropping to an almost whisper. I know you better than you think, he said. I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. I feel the tension every time we're in the same room. You can pretend all you want, but you can't hide from me. My breath hitched, and I looked away again, my face burning with a mix of anger, shame, and something I couldn't name. How dare he? How dare he say these things, as if he knew me better than I knew myself? But the truth was, his words hit too close to home. There were moments, fleeting, confusing moments, when I had felt something I couldn't explain. A warmth, a curiosity, a spark of something that shouldn't exist. I'd pushed those feelings down, buried them deep where no one could find them. Yet here he was, dragging them into the light. Stop it, I said, my voice cracking. Just stop. Caleb didn't move, didn't say anything. He just watched me, his eyes searching mine for, what? Understanding? Submission? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. You can hate me for saying it, he said after a long pause. You can even try to run from it. But it won't change anything. This is real. And you know it. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to stand tall. I don't know what you think this is, I said, my voice trembling with barely contained emotion. But you're wrong. You're so wrong. He didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked away, my hands trembling at my sides. But I could feel his eyes on me, following me out of the room. The weight of his gaze lingered long after I'd left. Once I was alone, I pressed my back against the wall and let out a shaky breath. My mind was racing, replaying his words over and over again. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the pressure building inside me. But all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the truth of his words crept into my thoughts. What if he was right? What if this wasn't something I could run from? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't shake it. No matter how hard I tried, his voice echoed in my mind, louder and more insistent with each passing second. That evening, his words echoed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. Maybe I'm waiting for you to figure it out yourself. What did he mean? What was I supposed to understand? I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning. Caleb had always been composed, calculated even, but there was something in his voice tonight, something that sent a chill down my spine. By the time morning came, I convinced myself I had overanalyzed everything. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just tired. I went about my day, trying to focus on anything else. But the atmosphere in the house felt different. Every time Caleb walked into the room, I felt an invisible tension pulling at me. His gaze lingered just a fraction too long, his tone softer, as if there was some secret only he and I shared. 3 days earlier, things had been normal, or at least, I thought they were. Caleb wasn't my father. He was my stepfather, and we weren't particularly close. He married my mother 5 years ago, and while their relationship seemed fine on the surface, they led mostly separate lives. Mom worked late hours, and Caleb was the kind of man who valued his space. I respected that. I thought he respected mine, too. But now, I wasn't so sure. It was the second night when I started noticing the subtle changes. I came downstairs to grab a glass of water. The house was silent, and I assumed I was the only one awake. But when I reached the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as soon as he heard my footsteps, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Just needed some water. What about you?" He smiled faintly, but it wasn't the kind of smile I was used to. It wasn't casual or polite. It felt different. "Maybe I'm just waiting for something," he said, his eyes fixed on me. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Waiting for what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Maybe I'm waiting for you to figure it out." There it was again, that strange, loaded comment. My stomach twisted uncomfortably. I don't know what you mean," I said, quickly grabbing my glass and turning toward the sink. My hands trembled slightly as I filled it with water. "You will," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. I didn't look back. I hurried upstairs, closing my bedroom door behind me. But even there, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. The next morning, Caleb acted as if nothing had happened. He greeted me with his usual calm demeanor, asking if I'd slept well. I mumbled something about being fine and quickly left for work, hoping distance would clear my head. But it didn't. That evening, Mom called to say she'd be working late again. It wasn't unusual, but it left Caleb and me alone in the house. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaning, watching TV, anything to avoid being in the same room with him for too long. But no matter where I went, it felt like he was always nearby. At one point, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment before taking a seat in the armchair across from me. "Long day?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I said, not looking up. He chuckled softly. "You don't have to avoid me, you know." I froze. "I'm not avoiding you." His smile widened slightly, but there was no humor in it. If you say so. The silence that followed was unbearable. I could feel his eyes on me, but I refused to meet his gaze. After what felt like an eternity, he stood up and left the room without another word. But the weight of his presence lingered long after he was gone. On the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The tension between us was palpable, like a thread being pulled tighter and tighter with every passing moment. I didn't know if it was something he was doing, or if it was all in my head. Maybe it was both. That evening, I decided to confront him, not directly, but enough to clear the air. I found him in the living room, reading a book. He looked up as I entered, raising an eyebrow. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Of course," he said, setting the book aside. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to phrase what I wanted to say. I feel like things have been different lately. Between us. He didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked amused. Different how? I don't know, I admitted, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "You've just been acting strange." "Strange," he repeated, his tone light, almost teasing. "How so?" "You know what I mean," I said, crossing my arms. "The way you've been talking to me, the things you've been saying. It's like you're trying to make me uncomfortable." His expression shifted slightly, his amusement giving way to something more serious. "That's not my intention," he said. "But if I've made you uncomfortable, I apologize." I blinked, caught off guard by his response. It was so calm, so measured, that I almost felt guilty for bringing it up. But before I could say anything, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice softer now. "What?" I asked warily. "Why does it bother you so much?" The question threw me. "What do you mean?" "Why does it bother you when I pay attention to you?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "When I notice things about you that other people might not?" My breath caught in my throat. Because it's not normal," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not normal," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Or not expected." I couldn't answer. The air between us felt heavy, charged with something I didn't want to name. That night, I lay in bed, replaying the conversation over and over in my mind. His words clung to me, refusing to let go. "Why does it bother you so much?" I didn't know the answer. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to admit it. For the first time, I realized that this wasn't just about Caleb. It was about me, about the things I felt, the things I didn't understand. And that scared me more than anything he could have said. The next day, I avoided him completely. I left the house early and didn't come back until late, hoping to escape the weight of his presence. But I knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Because no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the truth. Whatever was happening between us wasn't going away. And deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The more I avoided him, the more relentless Caleb became. It wasn't anything overt, no loud demands, no dramatic gestures. But his presence was constant, pressing in on me like an invisible force I couldn't escape. Every time I thought I'd found a moment of peace, he was there. A glance that lingered too long, a comment that seemed heavier than it should have been. And the worst part? I could feel my own resolve cracking. Mom's absence didn't help. Her work hours had stretched longer and longer, leaving Caleb and me alone in the house more often than not. I told myself it was just bad timing. But deep down, I wondered if she even noticed the tension between us. If she had any idea what was happening when she wasn't home. One evening, I was curled up on the couch, trying to lose myself in a mindless show. It was the only thing that seemed to dull the noise in my head these days. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I'd convinced myself Caleb was in his office. But then I heard his footsteps. I didn't look up. If I ignored him, maybe he'd just pass through and leave me alone. But instead, he stopped, standing just behind the couch. I could feel his eyes on me, even though I couldn't see him. "Why do you always leave when I walk into a room?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach twist. "I don't," I said quickly, my eyes glued to the screen in front of me. My voice sounded defensive, even to my own ears. He chuckled softly and moved around the couch, sitting down beside me. Too close. I shifted slightly, trying to put some distance between us, but he just leaned back, his arm resting casually along the top of the couch. "You do," he said. "Every time." Like you're afraid of me or something. I'm not afraid of you, I snapped, finally turning to look at him. Big mistake. His eyes were locked on mine, and there was something in them, something unreadable, but intense. Good, he said softly, leaning in just enough to make my heart race. Because you don't need to be. I wanted to respond, to push him away, but my mind was blank. I could feel the heat of his hand as it rested near my shoulder, close enough to touch, but not quite. And then, as if testing me, he reached out and lightly brushed his fingers against my arm. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. I jerked back, standing up so quickly I nearly tripped over the coffee table. Don't, I said, my voice trembling. Just don't. Caleb didn't follow me. He stayed where he was, watching me with that same maddening calm. You can deny it all you want, he said. But we both know the truth. It's only a matter of time. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I fled to my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. What the hell was happening? How had it come to this? That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my mind, refusing to let me rest. We both know the truth. What truth? What did he think I felt? What did I actually feel? The questions chased me until the early hours of the morning. I kept telling myself he was wrong, that this was all in his head. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. There was something between us, something I didn't understand and didn't want to name. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I couldn't keep living like this, jumping at every shadow, avoiding him at every turn. I needed to confront him, to put an end to whatever game he thought we were playing. The next evening, I found him in the kitchen. He was pouring a glass of wine, his movements slow and deliberate. When he saw me, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We need to talk, I said, crossing my arms. All right, he said, leaning against the counter. What's on your mind? I hesitated, suddenly unsure how to start. You've been acting strange, I said finally. And I don't know what you're trying to do, but it needs to stop. He raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his wine. Strange how? You know what I mean, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. The comments, the way you look at me, it's not normal. Not normal, he repeated, setting his glass down. Or not expected. His calm demeanor only made me angrier. It's wrong, I said, my voice rising. You're my stepfather. Am I? He asked, tilting his head slightly. Or am I just the man who happens to be married to your mother? The question hit me like a slap. I stared at him, struggling to find the words. That doesn't matter, I said finally. What you're doing, it's not okay. What am I doing, exactly? He asked, taking a step closer. I backed up instinctively, my heart pounding. You know what you're doing, I said. And it needs to stop. He stopped, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, he said quietly. If that's what you want. I blinked, caught off guard by his sudden shift in tone. That's it? I asked. You just going to stop? He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. If that's what will make you feel better, sure. But you should know something. What? I asked, my stomach tightening. You're lying to yourself, he said simply. And one day, you'll realize it. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong. But the words wouldn't come. I turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on me the entire time. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His words played over and over in my mind. You're lying to yourself. Was I? I didn't want to believe it, but the doubt was there, growing with every passing moment. And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Caleb wasn't the kind of man to give up so easily. Caleb's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. What's happening between us, he said again, his voice so calm it sent a shiver down my spine. I forced myself to hold his gaze, refusing to show the storm of emotions churning inside me. There's nothing happening, I said, my voice sharper than I intended, though the tremble beneath it betrayed me. His lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. You can say that all you want, but we both know it's not true. I took a step back, putting more distance between us. You're wrong, I said, though the words felt hollow, even to me. And you shouldn't be here. Get out. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen. He stayed still, his expression unreadable, before nodding slightly. All right, he said, his voice low. But this isn't over. You know that. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. I stood frozen in place, my chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The room felt too small, too claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in on me. The next morning, I tried to shake off the memory of Caleb's visit, but his words followed me everywhere. This isn't over. What did he mean by that? Was it a threat? A promise? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. At breakfast, I avoided looking at him. He sat at the table, reading the news on his phone like nothing had happened. My mother, oblivious as ever, chatted about her plans for the day. I nodded along, murmuring responses when necessary, but my mind was elsewhere. Caleb didn't say a word to me. Not a single glance, not a single comment. It should have been a relief, but instead it made me even more on edge. His silence felt deliberate, calculated. Like he was waiting for something. That evening, Mom announced she had a work dinner and wouldn't be home until late. I swallowed hard, trying to hide the panic that rose in my chest. Being alone with Caleb was the last thing I wanted, but I couldn't come up with an excuse to leave. As soon as Mom left, I retreated to my room, locking the door behind me. I tried to distract myself for reading, scrolling through my phone, but nothing worked. Every creak of the house made me jump, every shadow felt like a threat. And then, I heard it, a soft knock at my door. Go away, I called out, my voice shaky. I just want to talk, Caleb said from the other side. His tone was calm, almost soothing, but it only made me more nervous. I have nothing to say to you, I replied, my fingers gripping the edge of my blanket. There was a pause. Then, quietly, you can't avoid this forever. I didn't respond. After a moment, I heard his footsteps retreating, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But the relief was short-lived. Deep down, I knew he was right. This thing between us wasn't going away. And the more I tried to deny it, the more tangled up in it I became. The next day, I tried to act like everything was normal. I cleaned the house, ran errands, anything to keep myself busy. But Caleb's presence loomed over me like a shadow, even when he wasn't around. By late afternoon, I was exhausted physically, emotionally, mentally. I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV, when Caleb walked in. I stiffened immediately, my body tensing as he approached. Relax, he said, sitting down in the armchair across from me. I'm not here to bother you. Could have fooled me, I muttered under my breath. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't an amused smile. It was something else, something darker. You're wound so tight, he said. It's like you're afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you, I snapped, though my voice wavered slightly. Good, he said, leaning forward. Because you don't need to be. I'm not your enemy. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. I focused on the TV, pretending to be engrossed in whatever meaningless show was playing. But Caleb wasn't done. You know, he said after a moment, this could be so much easier if you'd just stop fighting it. I turned to glare at him. Fighting what? He tilted his head, studying me. You know what? No, I said firmly. I don't. And whatever you think this is, it's not real. It's not happening. His expression didn't change. If anything, he looked almost amused. You can keep telling yourself that, he said. But it won't change anything. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. You need to stop this, I said, my voice trembling with anger. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. Caleb stood as well, closing the distance between us in 2 steps. He didn't touch me, but he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make my heart race. This isn't a game, he said quietly. And you know it. I stared up at him, my chest heaving with shallow breaths. I wanted to scream, to shove him away, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. And then, just as suddenly as he'd approached, he stepped back. You should get some rest, he said, his tone light, as if we'd just been discussing the weather. You look tired. He walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling with a mix of fear and fury. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caleb's face, heard his voice. You know it. What did that even mean? And why did it make my stomach twist into knots? By the time morning came, I was running on fumes. I stumbled through the day in a haze, barely registering anything around me. But one thought kept creeping into my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. The air between us felt like it was electrified, every movement heavy with unspoken words. Caleb's gaze locked on mine, and I could feel the weight of everything we had avoided addressing for days. His hand brushed against my arm, not forceful, not hurried, but deliberate. It sent a jolt through me, a mix of fear, confusion, and something I didn't want to name. "Just let this happen," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. I stood frozen, every muscle in my body tense. Part of me screamed to leave, to put distance between us. But another part, the part one didn't understand, kept me rooted in place. His proximity was overwhelming, his presence filling every corner of the room. He reached out, his fingers lingering near mine. For a moment, I thought he was going to pull away, but instead, his hand hovered, waiting. It wasn't force, it was an invitation. And in that moment, I realized the choice was mine. What happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't thought through. It wasn't right. But it happened. It was quick, a blur of sensations and emotions that I couldn't process. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I could feel his hand on my back, his breath close to mine, and the last thread of resistance in me snapped. When it was over, the silence was deafening. Caleb stepped back, his expression unreadable. "We're okay," he said softly, as if those words could erase everything that had just happened. But I didn't feel okay. I didn't feel anything except a hollow ache in my chest. I stood there, unable to meet his eyes, every thought in my head tangled and incoherent. Later, alone in my room, the reality of what had just happened crashed over me like a wave. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, my back pressed against the bed. The tears came suddenly and without warning, hot and bitter as they streamed down my face. What had I done? The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. This wasn't a moment I could explain away or forget. It was a choice, a terrible, irreversible choice. And now I had to live with it. I glanced at the mirror across the room, barely able to recognize the person staring back at me. She looked like me, but she wasn't. She was someone who had crossed a line she could never uncross. Someone who had betrayed herself. In the days that followed, Caleb acted as if nothing had changed. He smiled, he made conversation, he moved through the house with his usual ease. But I couldn't do the same. Every time I looked at him, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Was it that easy for him? Did he not feel the same crushing weight of regret that I did? Or was he simply better at hiding it? If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that some choices can't be undone. They leave scars that don't fade, memories that don't disappear. And no matter how much you want to go back, to make a different choice, you can't. This story isn't about love. It isn't about temptation. It's about mistakes, and the cost of letting them happen. Sometimes, I wonder what people would do if they were in my position. Would they have made the same choice? Would they have stopped it? Let me know what you think, because maybe I could learn something from you.